Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Sattizahn, in your written testimony, you shared that in January of 2023, you launched a survey of Meta virtual reality users, including minors and adults. That survey revealed that nearly half of Meta's VR users experienced harm, and 1 in 10 users experienced severe harm such as racism or sexual inappropriateness. These aren't isolated incidents. They reflect a systematic problem across the platform. Correct me if you disagree.
Not at all.
Okay, so your survey also showed that Meta VR users, including minors, didn't know enough about the tools that exist intended to keep them safe. And yet, after your study revealed this, Meta denied multiple requests to invest in user education. Is that your understanding?
This is correct.
Okay. Like I asked, not just as a senator, but as a parent, to think that Meta would have resources available to better keep kids safe, but not implement them is beyond troubling. Just as we don't allow car companies to sell vehicles without seatbelts anymore, or drug companies to market medicines without clear safety labels, Meta's VR system should be no different. So my first question to you is, what resources would have been helpful? Who denied these requests and why?
The resourcing that would be helpful is staffing, is money. I mentioned in my disclosure, over my 6 years at Meta, I was always in this exact space, integrity and safety. One constant over my 6 years was not having enough money to build for safety. Our engineering staff was always understaffed. Research staff was always understaffed. You might have noticed, but I was the only researcher for integrity across virtual reality software. That still gives me goosebumps when I think about it, because I think I'm a good researcher. No researcher is good enough to cover that whole space by themselves. The thing that would have helped is taking the resourcing from chasing the next shiny object just to boost user engagement, and given some of those resources, that time, that money to our teams trying to build for safer products.
Thank you. Now, also recall a hearing that we had in the last Congress in this committee when CEOs of the 5 social media companies, including Meta, testified. It was a full committee, not the subcommittee. And I recall asking each of them to share data with us about not just the tools available for minors and for parents, but what the adoption rates were for those tools. Surprise, surprise, they didn't share a whole ton of information, and what limited data we did receive suggested that the adoption rates were very low. So as a follow-up question, in your testimony, you wrote through your survey research that virtually no one used parental supervision controls in Meta VR. Why are adoption rates so low, and what can be done, should be done, to improve those adoption rates?
Yeah, so both my colleague and I have worked in this space so long that we've known at Meta internally that these types of parental controls were not sufficient to keep individuals safe. I'd have to go back, and I'm happy to follow up on this. I believe the earliest report that I saw was from 2018, an Instagram report showing that these types of parental controls that I believe Mr. Zuckerberg was referring to in this case were not sufficient for parents to keep children safe. And so when we look into my research and we see somewhere between, I believe it was 2 to 10% of adoption rates, it didn't surprise me, because not even the adults, the children who are experiencing VR in this case, even see these things as valuable, because from the onset, they weren't actually built to be valuable for those people using them. I don't know if you have anything to add, because you also work in this space.
Ms. Savage, please.
Yeah, if I may. I mean, certainly the parental supervision tools are not sufficient, in large part because there's no parent education. And particularly when we're talking about VR, we know that usually the kids are the ones using the headsets and the parents are not using VR, and it's fundamentally a different world. So parents don't understand the risks that children face. They don't understand the ways that they should be supervising. And this is something that I flagged to Meta leadership that we needed to make a priority, and it is not been meaningfully actioned on. So.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I thank you both for your testimony, and may follow up with questions for the record after the hearing today. Thank you.
During the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing held on Tuesday, Senator Alex Padilla, Democrat, California, engaged former Meta researcher Jason Sattizahn in a discussion about the findings of a survey conducted by Sattizahn in January 2023. The survey, which focused on Meta's virtual reality (VR) users, included both minors and adults. The results were concerning. Nearly half of the users reported experiencing harm, and 1 in 10 reported severe experiences, such as racism or sexual inappropriateness. Sattizahn made it clear that these incidents were not isolated cases but reflected a widespread, systemic issue across Meta's VR platform. The testimony further revealed that many of the users, especially minors, were unaware of the safety tools available to protect them while using VR. Despite these alarming findings, Sattizahn shared that Meta had repeatedly denied requests to invest in user education. This lack of action on Meta's part was particularly troubling, given that the company had the resources to address these concerns but chose not to implement them. Sattizhahn's remarks seemed to highlight a fundamental problem in Meta's approach to VR safety, one that could have serious implications for user well-being, particularly for vulnerable groups like children. Senator Padilla expressed his deep concerns about Meta's failure to prioritize safety. He approached the issue not only from his position as a senator but also as a parent. Padilla compared Meta's lack of action on safety to how car companies are required to include seatbelts in vehicles and how pharmaceutical companies must include clear safety labels on medicines. He suggested that VR systems, especially those used by minors, should be held to similar standards of safety. Padilla's analogy underlined the gravity of the situation. Allowing a platform as influential as Meta to operate without adequate safety measures for minors was not only reckless but inexcusable. Sattizahn confirmed that during his 6 years at Meta, safety and integrity teams were chronically understaffed and underfunded. The resources that were allocated to the VR department often went to boosting user engagement, developing new features, or chasing the next trend to attract more users. Meanwhile, the engineering and research teams, particularly the research team dedicated to VR safety, were woefully understaffed. Sattizahn revealed that he was the only researcher responsible for integrity across Meta's VR software, a job that, despite his best efforts, was simply too much for one person to handle. His comments highlighted a fundamental issue at Meta. There was an evident lack of commitment to safety in favor of short-term goals related to user engagement. The hearing also touched on the failure of parental control tools in Meta's VR system. Despite claims that such tools existed, Sattizhahn's survey found that adoption rates were alarmingly low. Virtually no one was using Meta's parental supervision tools. Senator Padilla had previously asked CEOs of major social media companies to provide data on the use and adoption of parental control features. The data Meta provided showed disturbingly low adoption rates. Sattizahn agreed with this assessment, explaining that even adults using VR did not see these tools as valuable. The tools were not built to meet the needs of the users, which led to their low adoption rate. The lack of proper resources dedicated to improving parental supervision tools was another issue that came up during the hearing. A second witness, who had also worked within Meta, shared their perspective on why the tools failed to serve their purpose. They pointed out that the parents of VR users often lacked an understanding of the virtual world their children were engaging with. Since most parents did not use VR themselves, they did not fully grasp the risks that came with it. As a result, they were ill-equipped to supervise their children's experiences in virtual environments. This gap in understanding made it more difficult for parents to effectively utilize the existing supervision tools. The witness further criticized Meta's lack of action, despite previous warnings. They recalled having raised concerns internally at Meta about the inadequacy of parental supervision tools and the need for better safety measures. However, these concerns were largely ignored by the company's leadership. The failure to act on these issues, despite the internal awareness, was seen as a critical shortcoming in Meta's responsibility toward its users. Senator Padilla concluded the hearing by thanking the witnesses for their testimony and signaling that he would likely follow up with additional questions. However, the key takeaway from the hearing was the urgent need for Meta to make substantial improvements to its VR platform, particularly in terms of safety for minors. The hearing underscored the systemic problems in Meta's approach to VR safety and the company's failure to address these concerns, despite having the resources to do so. For many, the lack of accountability and action on these issues raises serious questions about the responsibility tech companies have toward their users, especially when those users are vulnerable minors. The hearing emphasized the necessity for stronger regulations and accountability, as well as for tech companies to prioritize user safety and well-being, particularly when children are involved. The discussion made it clear that, without proper safety education and resources, VR platforms like Meta's could pose significant risks to users, especially to the younger and more vulnerable populations who are increasingly exposed to these immersive technologies.